There is a crate in the deep forgotten storage of the Chicago Historical Society, kept in a climate-controlled room where the public is never invited. It sits on a reinforced steel rack, anonymous and gray, marked only with a faded serial number that corresponds to a 1893 demolition manifest from the world's Columbian Exposition. Inside that crate, there is no gold, no fine art, and no grand inventions. There is only leather, 12,000 pairs of shoes. They were recovered during the final demolition of a forgotten sub-basement section near what used to be the Midway Plaisance in Jackson Park. These are not storeroom leftovers or unsold inventory. These are worn shoes. When you hold them, you can see the indentations of human heels, the salt stains of sweat, and the deep scuff marks of people who walked long distances on gravel and stone. There are heavy, mud-caked leather work boots from laborers who traveled from the east. There are delicate silk-lined evening pumps with worn-down soles, once belonging to the elite of the quote, _0, __. Most chillingly, there are thousands of tiny hand-stitched children's slippers, some still tied with frayed ribbons, others missing their laces. All of them were found neatly stacked, organized by size and material, as if waiting for owners who were expected to return, but never did. And here is what makes that significant. In every official history of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, the narrative is one of, quote, one, they call it the White City. They tell us it was a miracle of, quote, two, a fragile mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber, built in just 24 months to be burned and forgotten once the spectacle was over. They want us to believe that hundreds of neoclassical palaces, some stretching over 30 acres, were mere stage sets. But a plaster city does not require the massive, deep foundation limestone basements where these shoes were found. A temporary city does not require a fully integrated underground transport system, heavy-gauge steel plumbing, or a power grid that rivaled any permanent capital in Europe. You do not dig 60-foot deep foundations for a building made of plaster and hemp. Beethoven's tuning fork tells us about a lost frequency. These shoes tell us about a lost population. Between May and October of 1893, 27 million people supposedly visited the Chicago World's Fair. To put that number in perspective, the entire population of the United States at the time was only 65 million. Nearly half of the nation converged on a single point in Illinois. It was the largest human gathering in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And yet, when you look at the high-resolution, long-exposure photographs from the era, something is profoundly wrong. You see the grand neoclassical palaces, the massive 200-foot domes, and the 264-foot Ferris wheel. But the avenues are often ghostly. Figures are blurred into nothingness, or the streets are impossibly empty for a place hosting 300,000 people a day. The official explanation is that camera technology required long shutter speeds, quote, 3 moving people from the frame. But we have crisp, clear photos of horse-drawn carriages and stationary guards from the same period. The emptiness of the White City isn't a technical limitation. It's a visual record of a space that was designed for a capacity that the visitors never actually filled, or perhaps they were being moved through it in a way the cameras weren't meant to capture. We are told the White City was a fair, but the architecture, the massive crystalline columns, the resonant vaults, suggests it was a facility. Consider the timeline of documentation. In 1890, the United States Census was completed. It was the most detailed snapshot of the American people ever taken, using the revolutionary new Hollerith tabulating machines. For the first time, the government truly knew exactly who was here, where they came from, their trades, their families, and their locations. It was a digital age ledger in a steam age world. It was the big data anchor for the transition into the 20th century. Then, on January 10th, 1921, that entire census was destroyed in a fire at the Department of Commerce. There were no local copies, no backups. The record of the transition generation, the people who lived through 1893, was physically eliminated. Every name, every family tie, every physical witness to the pre-reset world was incinerated in a single afternoon. But The erasure began much earlier, in the fires of Chicago. On July 10, 1893, the cold storage building at the fair ignited, killing firefighters and spectators in a horrific display of unpredictable fire behavior. Then, on the very night the fair ended, a series of massive, suspicious fires began to systematically level the White City. One by one, the grandest buildings on Earth, the Administration Building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, the Electricity Building, were reduced to ash. The official story is that homeless people, or accidental sparks, destroyed the most advanced architectural achievement of the century. But you don't build 200 stone-clad palaces with advanced electrical grids just to burn them 6 months later. You don't build them out of plaster if they are meant to hold the structural weight of 27 million visitors. We are told the White City was a spectacle. But if you follow the trail of what was destroyed, it begins to look like a processing center, a place where millions entered and a refined population emerged, while the artifacts of the old world were left behind in the basements. Look at the Orphan Trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were moved from the East Coast to the rural West. Many were not orphans. They had parents. They had names. But those names were changed, their origins were scrubbed, and they were distributed into a new life. This massive state-sponsored relocation peaked exactly during the era of the Great Fairs. At the 1893 fair itself, there was a dedicated children's building. There were even baby incubators on display, as a sideshow on the Midway. Living infants, kept in glass boxes, supposedly to demonstrate modern medical progress. But where did the babies come from? And where did they go when the fair burned down? Why were they being displayed as curiosities in a place designed to disappear? Why were these orphans being processed at the same time the 1890 census was being prepared for its eventual destruction? The 12,000 shoes found in that Chicago basement represent a missing data set that the 1921 census fire ensured we would never reconcile. In the 3 years following the 1893 fair, missing person reports across the Midwest spiked by over 400%. Entire families would board a train for Chicago to see the future and never return to their farms. Their property was seized, their accounts were closed, and they vanished. In a world before fingerprints, before digital tracking, and before the 1921 census fire, a person could be erased simply by losing their luggage and their records. They became part of the new population. Their old lives burned away with the plaster of the White City. They were given new identities, new roles in the industrialized world, or they simply ceased to exist in the records. Now, look at the architecture of the fair itself. The White City was designed by Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted. It was a masterpiece of neoclassical symmetry. Но это были не просто здания, это были резонансные камеры. The Court of Honor was designed with precise acoustic proportions, matched to the water in the Grand Basin. Like the Byzantine churches with their embedded acoustic vases, the White City was an instrument of frequency. The peristyle, the Grand Basin, the Golden Arch, these are not the names of fairground attractions. These are the components of a massive acoustic generator. In 1893, we were in the heat of the War of the Currents. Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse had won the contract to light the fair using alternating current. For the first time, millions of people were exposed to a massive, synchronized electrical field. The fair wasn't just lit, it was humming. Every building was wired, every avenue was a conductor. The quote, _for, weren't just looking at exhibits. They were standing inside a giant electrified resonator. We are told the ringing in the ears is a modern ailment caused by headphones. But the records of nervous exhaustion, brain fog, and auditory hallucinations among fairgoers suggest that the frequency shift began there. It was the first time the human biological frequency was forcibly realigned to the 440 Hz standard, and then it was all gone. By 1894, the White City was a charred wasteland. The technology was scrapped. The staff buildings were demolished. The 1890 census was eventually burned. The generation that saw the old world and the new world collide was silenced. I spent weeks looking for a coordinated plan behind the 1893 fires. I looked for a memo, a secret directive, a villain. I didn't find one. What I found was something more unsettling, a pattern of underscore underscore, quote underscore 1, 3, underscore underscore underscore. The Chicago fire of 1871 cleared the land of the underscore underscore, quote underscore 1, 4, underscore underscore vernacular structures. The 1893 fair, underscore underscore, quote underscore 1, 5, underscore underscore, the New World and its standards. The 1894 fires cleared the physical evidence of the fair's true construction. The 1921 fire cleared the names of the people who were there. The 1933 National Archives cornerstone was laid just as the last witnesses were authorized for retirement. The process was automated. It is the same pattern we see with the destruction of the 425,000 bells in Europe. Each event has a reasonable excuse: war, revolution, progress, accident. But the result is always a total loss of the previous state. When the 12,000 shoes were found in 1934, the city didn't launch an investigation. They didn't ask why 12,000 people left their footwear in a sealed basement. They didn't try to match the leather to the missing person files of 1893. They didn't photograph them for the newspapers. They boxed them up. They moved them to a basement. And they waited for the people who remembered the White City to die. The last person who could have recognized the stitching on those shoes or the name inside those boots died decades ago. We are told that we live in the most documented era in history, but our documentation only goes back as far as the current frequency allows it. If your family history starts with a fire in a European village, a lost record at Ellis Island, or a name change in 1895, you are part of the erasure. You are the descendant of the people who walked through the White City and left their shoes behind. You are a citizen of a standardized world, tuned to a pitch that Beethoven would have found alien and dead. The buildings of the 1893 fair were not made of plaster. You can still find the foundations in Jackson Park if you know where to dig. You can see the old world stonework, colossal granite and limestone blocks that don't match the 19th century, quote, one technology we are told existed. Those buildings were generators of a frequency we no longer understand. They were the physical anchors of a different reality, one where energy was atmospheric and sound was a tool of healing, not a weapon of tinnitus. The White City was the last, quote, too, on American soil. When the fair was destroyed, we weren't just losing a tourist attraction. We were losing the last physical evidence of a global civilization that understood resonance, free energy, and the true nature of the human spirit. We were reset into a world of coal, oil, and 440 Hz standard tuning. A world where we are disconnected from our ancestors and told that our history is only a few centuries old. A world where 12,000 pairs of shoes can sit in a basement for a century without a single person asking who they belong to. The White City was the final performance of the old world. It was a showcase of what we used to be, disguised as a vision of what we were becoming. They invited us in to see the splendor. They recorded our names on the census. They exposed us to the new frequency, and then they burned the theater while we were still inside. Consider the White City as a literal filter. If you were compliant, if you accepted the new frequency, if you took the new name, you were let out the other side into the 20th century. If you weren't, your shoes stayed in the basement. Your frequency was 2 underscore underscore, quote underscore 7 underscore underscore. You didn't fit the new standard. The 1893 fair was not a celebration of progress. It was an audit of the human soul. The stone of Chicago remembers what the history books erased. The basements that shouldn't exist still hold the echoes of the underscore underscore, quote underscore 8 underscore underscore who never checked out. And the question we should be asking is not why the buildings burned. The question is, if 27 million people walked into that city and the records of their lives were burned 30 years later, who are we actually? Are we the descendants of the visitors, or are we the descendants of the people who were, quote, 9 inside? We have the architecture. We have the, quote, 10 reports. We have the 12, 0 pairs of shoes. What we don't have is the truth. That was melted down with the Russian bells and burned with the French archives. And the people who remembered the sound of the White City, the real sound, the one that matched the heartbeat of the earth before the tinnitus began, are gone. The crate stays in the dark, the shoes stay empty. They are a physical void in our history. Each pair represents a story that was forcibly ended, a lineage that was diverted, and a witness who was removed from the timeline. We walk the streets of modern Chicago built on top of these foundations, wearing modern shoes, listening to modern frequencies, never realizing that we are walking over a mass grave of identity. The White City wasn't built for us to admire. It was built to replace us. It was the machinery of the Great Reset, functioning in broad daylight, under the guise of a festival. In 1900, the Smithsonian destroyed 40,000 artifacts from the Transition era. In 1921, the Census burned. In 1934, the shoes were boxed. Each decade, another layer of the truth is covered in plaster and ash. We are told the 1890s was the gay 90s, a time of fluff and fashion. But the 1890s was the decade of the Great Erasure. It was the decade where the world stopped being quiet and started ringing. It was the decade where 12,000 people left their shoes in a basement and vanished into a fire that official history says was an accident, and nobody said anything. We are left with the ringing, a permanent, low-level frequency that fills the silence where our history used to be. We are told it's a medical condition. We are told it's in our heads. But maybe it's just the sound of a world that was tuned to a different pitch, crying out from under the plaster and the ash. The 12,000 shoes are the only thing holding that sound in place. And as long as they stay in that crate, the truth stays in the dark. The question isn't which frequency is right. The question is, what happened to the people who knew the difference? The people who didn't just visit the White City, but belonged to it. They are gone, and they took the silence with them. All we have left are the empty shoes and the ringing in our ears. They built the modern world on top of a basement full of leather. And they made sure we would never know the names of the people who wore them. The last American who remembered the sound of the White City died in 1953. She told her family that the world became, quote, one after 1893. She said the air stopped carrying the music. They thought she was just old. They thought she was losing her mind. But she was just one of the few who made it through the gate with her shoes still on. And her ears still tuned to the frequency of the stone. The crate is still there. The serial number is still valid. But the story has been erased. The White City burned, the census burned, and the silence began. And as you sit here listening to this, with that faint ringing in your ears, you have to ask yourself, whose shoes are you wearing? The stone remembers what we chose to forget, and the foundations are still humming, waiting for someone to play the instrument again. But the founders are gone, the bronze is melted, and the leather is cold. The White City wasn't a fair, it was a goodbye, and the world hasn't been the same since.